Perhaps the most frightening crimes are those involving completely unmotivated and inexplicable brutality, especially when children are affected. Judging by these parameters, today's story is one of the most heinous and cruel cases in global criminal history. Louisa Koekemoer was born near Western Area, South Africa. Fate had always intertwined her life with violent people. In 1984, when she was 10 years old, her father died. The child had a close relationship with him. Despite working a lot, he always had time for his daughter. Soon after her father's death, Louisa's mother found a new man, but the stepfather turned out to be a bad person. He constantly humiliated the entire family, both morally and physically. His years of abuse were not in vain, as he made Louisa feel inferior. He did everything he could to make those around him feel worthless. As she grew up, Louisa could no longer endure this treatment and sought a way to distance herself from her family. So she hastily married the first man she met. His name was Freddie. He was 4 years older than her and, to her dismay, no better than her stepfather. Her husband plunged her into an atmosphere of terror and constant fear. Fortunately, the young woman was lucky, and with the support of her mother, Louisa was able to free herself from the oppression of this relationship. After separating from Freddie, Louisa met a mechanic named Christo van der Merwe. He was quiet, hardworking, and caring and seemed to suit her much better. They began dating and soon married. The newlyweds continued to live in the same area of South Africa. The couple first had a little boy they named Johan. 2 years later, on August 9, 2013, Poppie van der Merwe was born. The girl was astonishingly beautiful, with blonde hair and large blue eyes. Everyone who knew her emphasized the child's beauty, called her a doll, and admired Poppie. Unfortunately for Louisa, her new marriage was also doomed to fail. After the children were born, her husband changed dramatically before her eyes and became violent. Soon, abuse began. The young mother realized that this had to end, as it wouldn't get better. In 2014, just a year after her daughter's birth, she filed for divorce. According to the woman's confession, Christo beat her, just like her previous partner, and shortly before the divorce, he threatened to kill her. He began to behave so inappropriately that the mother of two was forced to obtain a restraining order against him. After the divorce, he had the right to 3 visits a month, during which he could interact with the children, but only under the supervision of a social worker. Additionally, he was allowed to call his children once a week. Most of these conversations were subsequently recorded. Christo adhered to all regulations and seemed to be a responsible person. Louisa, however, claimed he was a real monster. Soon, the young mother decided to move with her 2 children, and she found herself 500 kilometers away in the small settlement of Orania. In fact, it was a very small settlement with just over 1,000 inhabitants. The population consisted exclusively of white people, and the settlement was one of the safest in the region. The descendants of Dutch, German, and French settlers lived there. The protagonist of our story believed she could finally build a peaceful life for herself and her children. The small family was welcomed by the Orania community. The locals and members of the Dutch Reformed Church took them in and helped the family settle. Thanks to their assistance, the young mother found an apartment and a job in a local supermarket. Additionally, community members helped finalize the divorce proceedings Louisa was undergoing. The woman also wanted to bring her daughter from a previous marriage, Marisha, away from her tyrannical father. The girl wanted to stay with her stepmother and, in return, take on much of the housework and help care for the younger children. With the help of community members, the young mother managed to take in the then 14-year-old student. She helped care for the children and also handled some of the daily household tasks to support Louisa. The teenager was given responsibility for cooking and cleaning. She integrated so seamlessly into this small family that the children sometimes called her mom. Marisha was naturally calmer than Louisa, which enabled her to manage the upbringing of small children better than a mother could. All this, of course, happened against the backdrop of Louisa's heavy workload, which consumed all her time and energy. In 2015, a man named Koekemoer moved to Orania. He, too, was helped by community members and was offered a job at the local supermarket, where he met the mother of 2 children who had been living there for about a year. Like the heroine of our story, he had a series of failed marriages and relationships behind him. With each of his ex-wives, he had a child. In fact, he had been divorced twice. For his first child, he paid monthly child support. The man had little or no contact with his children and showed no interest in them. He had a very bad relationship with all his ex-wives. They called him a cruel man who knew no compassion. Unfortunately, Louisa didn't know this when she first met him. However, he seemed nice and friendly, as he had been more than once before, and so she let him into her life. She and Koekemoer entered into a romantic relationship quite quickly. A few months after they met, Louisa became engaged to him. Afterwards, the couple moved in together, and on November 14th of that year, 2015, they married. The day after the wedding, Koekemoer suddenly threw Merwe out of the house and sent her by bus to her father's home, so her favorite nanny and sister could no longer care for the children. This change in family life was very traumatic for the children. Johan and Poppie were very attached to Merwe, who was now replaced by a new man who paid them little attention. Because of this sudden change, the children became very moody. They found it hard to cope with the separation from their sister. To the great disappointment of the children, Koekemoer soon turned out to be the exact opposite of what they had expected. Merwe's care gave the children a sense of being needed and loved. She spent a lot of time with them and became a close person. The stepfather, on the other hand, was very irritable and constantly snapped at the children whenever they cried. During this time, both children were enrolled in a kindergarten as the adults were working and could no longer care for their daughter and son at home. The caregiver repeatedly saw the boy run away and hide in the bathroom when his mother and stepfather came to pick him up from kindergarten. The children did not want to go home. This was a clear sign. The kindergarten staff described Koekemoer as a very irritable and unpleasant man who seemed cold toward the children. On several occasions, the kindergarten staff noticed that the child behaved inappropriately when the parents brought him in. It was as if he was under the influence of medication. His reactions were slow. For this reason, it was suspected that the boy had been given sedatives. Johan was a very active boy. His parents had probably drugged him to manage and control him better. However, this was only a suspicion that could not be confirmed. When the caregivers asked the couple about this, they just laughed. No further such states were observed in the child later on. However, new symptoms of abuse appeared, which initially were not taken seriously. The caregivers noticed that the boy was often dressed in weather-inappropriate clothing, specifically the long-sleeved jackets and clothes in which the child was often brought to kindergarten, even in hot weather. Later, it was learned that this was done intentionally to hide the bruises on his body. When they tried to undress Johan, he became aggressive and prevented the caregivers from doing so he wore a jacket all day. According to the boy, his parents became very angry if he took off his thick clothing. Obviously, the parents intimidated the boy to prevent the revelation of domestic abuse to the care staff. After Louisa and Koekemoer began to question their behavior in the family, they simply stopped bringing Johan to kindergarten, while Poppie continued to attend regularly. According to law enforcement authorities, it was decided to stop bringing the younger girl to kindergarten because she was being asked questions and could not explain what was happening at home. Despite her obvious communication difficulties, the child tried to reveal the horrors of domestic violence. Little Poppie repeatedly told caregivers various horror stories and tried to show the bruises on her body, but the adults simply did not understand her. Over time, however, the caregivers noticed that the bruises on the child's body appeared in various strange places. They could appear on the earlobes or other atypical parts of the body. New bruises appeared faster than old injuries healed. Louisa and Koekemoer were repeatedly questioned about this. Each time, the couple invented new stories about the children's activities. According to the mother and stepfather, both Johan and Poppie were restless, ran and jumped a lot, so all the girls' injuries supposedly resulted from playing or carelessness. Since domestic violence could not be proven, the caregivers had to believe these stories. Moreover, the mother often claimed that the girl's older brother behaved aggressively toward her. Louisa pointed to Johan's behavior when she tried to explain why he no longer attended kindergarten. According to the mother, she was afraid that her son might traumatize one of the children, and therefore wanted to bring him back to kindergarten only when he was older and his stubbornness could be managed. The whole situation seemed strange to them, as the caregivers had never noticed that the boy behaved dangerously and aggressively in the presence of other children. On the contrary, he was intimidated and did not make contact. Despite the lengthy excuses, there were other people who suspected domestic violence in the family. A man who lived in the couple's neighborhood noticed that the adults were clearly violent toward the small children. He regularly heard arguments and saw the parents scolding and shouting at their daughter and son. Apparently, this behavior was triggered by the slightest misbehavior. The neighbor did not witness physical beatings firsthand, but he was sure they not only punished their children verbally, but also physically. One of the most unpleasant incidents, as the neighbor later recounted, involved Poppie. According to him, on one of the usual days, the stepfather began shouting loudly at the child, probably because the girl had wet the bed. Minutes after the scolding, the child began to scream loudly, and it was clear that she was not just crying out of resentment, but seemed to be beaten. The next day, the neighbor saw the little girl with a cast on her leg. The man also noticed the parents' indifference when they brought their daughter home from the hospital with a new cast. Her mother and stepfather didn't even help her out of the pickup truck. They drove their daughter around in the back seat of the truck like some kind of animal. The little girl not only struggled to get out of the truck, but also carried her backpack, which seemed quite heavy. Instead of supporting and helping her, her stepfather just hurried her along. The neighbor noticed that Poppie would wake up at night and cry. In his opinion, the child had nightmares, but instead of comforting her, the parents, whenever they reacted to her tears, would shout and swear at her, forcing her to be quiet. Nevertheless, she had such episodes almost every night, and the girl would cry quietly for about half an hour so that no one would hear her. But through the thin walls, the neighbor could hear the sobbing. Eventually, she would calm down on her own and fall back asleep. After the incident with the broken leg, and once the girl had recovered, there was another frightening case of aggression. A neighbor heard another argument begin in the family, followed by a dull thud. The girl again cried heavily and became hysterical. The neighbor saw her the next day as she walked around with a large hematoma on her head. Moreover, her right arm didn't seem to function properly. Poppie kept pressing it against her chest. At this point, the man couldn't take it anymore and went to her stepfather. He asked what was happening to the child, why the girl was constantly crying, and why she barely had time to heal her severe injuries. Koekemoer just grinned and became angry. He gave no answer and simply walked away. Instead, the children's mother spoke up. According to Louisa, the latest injuries were caused by a fall while playing on the stairs. She claimed the girl was very careless and constantly got into such incidents. It was just an accident, but the neighbor didn't believe her. What most outraged the neighbor was an incident in the winter when Koekemoer was working in the garden. It was quite cold, and the children were sitting on the porch. Suddenly, the man shouted at them and accused them of doing something wrong. The neighbor found this strange. He hadn't noticed the siblings doing anything bad. They were just sitting quietly. Then he undressed the children and doused them with cold water. The perverse man made them repeat some kind of apology that the neighbor couldn't understand. They did this while standing in the cold until they dried off, with the children crying and shivering violently. At the very least, they could have gotten sick. When the neighbor saw the abuse with his own eyes, he couldn't bear it anymore and went to social services. The staff of the organization should have investigated, written a report for the police, and then, of course, filed a request with law enforcement. However, there were no repercussions. The Social Protection Service simply ignored the incidents and the neighbor's statements. The man had to contact the organization several times until they finally took notice of the blatant brutality of the stepfather. The town was so small that it didn't even have a proper police station, court, or other important institutions. The nearest larger police station was at least 40 kilometers away, and the neighbor had no way to get there himself. But he didn't give up and kept contacting various organizations in his town to help the children. Fortunately, the cruelty did not go unnoticed, at least not by child protection officers. The children had a chance to end this nightmare. In August 2016, a meeting with Louisa and Koekemoer took place. The mother and stepfather were required to attend weekly checkups with a pediatrician, which both children had to attend. Additionally, the parents were obliged to attend special counseling sessions with a psychologist who dealt with family problems. The couple adhered to these rules for a while, but as it turned out, it was only for accountability. They went to counseling a few times in the first month and took the children to medical appointments only twice. It seemed they were on the path to improvement, but during this time, the neighbor reported the worst cases of domestic violence. When he again approached social services about this, he was once again brushed off with the excuse that they were already working with the family and had everything under control. But for some reason, that wasn't working, and the neighbor, for his part, could do nothing more. The man's words were quickly confirmed during the next medical examination. Multiple bruises were found on the body of 3-year-old Poppie. The girl was examined to determine their origin. Given her age, however, she was still very hard to understand. Her explanation only revealed that she was in great pain. In fact, the doctor conducting such examinations should have immediately documented any bruises. But in this case, the specialist did not follow procedures. The doctor later attributed the lack of documentation to the fact that the 3-year-old was unable to explain what had happened to her, and he assumed the bruises were ones she had gotten at home. The doctor simply attributed it to an accident while playing, which the mother, as usual, began to narrate, and no action was taken. One September morning in 2016, the neighbor woke up to find that Poppie's troubled family had moved out. They had done so under the cover of night, as if intentionally avoiding unnecessary witnesses, which aroused suspicion. Nevertheless, Koekemoer did not give up his job, and the staff at the kindergarten Poppie attended were not informed of the move. In fact, the couple wanted to evade responsibility and avoid a medical examination where they had nearly been caught. The parents decided to disappear and move to their new residence. Louisa and Koekemoer traveled to the farm Mamogalieskral, which was several hours away from the town. There, they lived with Louisa's family. It was a rare occasion for Louisa and her mother, along with their children, to be in one place. In fact, she rarely allowed the little ones to spend time with their grandmother. Louisa's mother, who herself had lived with an abuser for years, was shocked when she saw the children's condition. Louisa's mother immediately noticed the numerous bruises that covered almost the entire bodies of the children. When the grandmother tried to find out from the boy where all these injuries came from, he said Koekemoer had beaten him. Meanwhile, Louisa denied the domestic violence and labeled Johan a liar. After this visit, the woman became worried about what was happening in her daughter's family, but she was afraid of hurting her. Therefore, she decided to confide only in her pastor. To her great regret, The church pastor became angry instead of helping or at least supporting her. In the pastor's view, the grandmother should not interfere in her daughter's affairs since she was already married and should solve such problems herself. After that, Louisa's mother no longer contacted other services and did not try to help her grandchildren. On October 25, 2016, just 1 month after the family had refused medical examinations, Louisa ran into the local hospital with her daughter in her arms. She urgently demanded that medical staff help Poppie and perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, stating that the girl had been unconscious for some time. All efforts were in vain. The staff immediately noticed the mother's suspicious behavior. It seemed as if she was completely indifferent to the child's fate. At the same time, she said she didn't want any trouble with the police. Even more suspicious were the child's injuries. Almost the entire body of the girl was one large bruise. When the mother was asked where all these bruises came from, she said her husband had rushed to the hospital because of the bad road, and the child had been severely shaken in the back seat of the car, causing bruises. This lie was quickly disproven. Bruises in various stages of healing were found on Poppie's body, indicating regular beatings of the girl. The bruises hadn't had time to disappear before new ones appeared. It was impossible to explain them by careless driving. The doctor noticed that the family had arrived with a second child. He immediately saw that 5-year-old Johan was cowering in a corner, trying to stay away from his parents and avoiding eye contact with adults. The child clenched his teeth and muttered something to himself. When asked what had happened, the boy replied, "Poppie doesn't want to eat anymore." Moreover, he had bruises on his body. All of this looked too suspicious and seemed to be connected to the incident in which a 3-year-old girl had died. So the doctor decided to call the police. Louisa and Koekemoer immediately tried to dissuade him, but the doctor ignored their words. When the first police officer arrived at the clinic, the doctor showed him a picture of Poppie's body. The police officer was a father himself. His child had just turned 1 year old. He was so stunned by the extent of the girl's mutilation that he wept. In his many years as a policeman, he had never seen such a mutilated body, not even that of an adult, let alone that of a little girl who had just learned to stand on her own feet. The stepfather was immediately taken to the police station, but Louisa was not detained because it was believed that she, like the children, had been a victim of domestic violence all these years. The true story of the 3-year-old's death will probably never be told. It was partially reconstructed based on witness statements, including a neighbor, a grandmother, the mother of the murdered girl, the murderer's statements, and physical evidence. But almost all the material contains inconsistencies and contradictions. While Koekemoer was taken to the station and interrogated, the officers decided to speak with Louisa. The woman said that the child had hit her head on a cupboard shortly before her death. This happened on the evening of October 24th. When the girl woke up the next day, she seemed to behave strangely. She appeared half asleep, inactive, barely spoke, and hardly moved. In the afternoon, Koekemoer returned from work. He was always in a bad mood, but that day Louisa asked him not to bully the children, who were unwell. But he didn't listen to her, and instead of greeting her, he kicked her in the stomach. According to the mother of the dead child, he did this almost every day. She didn't wait for the end of the beating and simply went shopping, and she recounted this quite calmly. When Louisa returned, Koekemoer said the girl was sick and had fainted. The mother found her daughter lying lifeless in the bathtub. She immediately noticed that the body was very cold and the lips were blue. They tried to resuscitate the girl, but it had no effect. They then decided to take her to the hospital and placed her on the back seat of a pickup truck. Then came one of the strangest parts of the story. Instead of carrying the 3-year-old girl in their arms, they threw her like an object into the empty cargo bed of the truck, where she slid around like a doll on the road's bumps. At the same time, this became a very convenient explanation for the numerous bruises that covered the deceased's body. When the grandmother saw the condition of her granddaughter, she simply couldn't believe that her own daughter could be involved. Like others, she didn't take seriously the idea that such injuries could occur from accidentally hitting a cupboard. According to investigators and the coroner, the child had been beaten for a long time, possibly even thrown against walls and furniture. According to the autopsy report, a large amount of blood had accumulated on the lower left side of the child's skull, characteristic of a severe head injury that could have been fatal. Abrasions were found all over the victim's body, particularly numerous on the face, chest, and thighs. It seemed as if the child had been kicked. This was confirmed by the victim's mother. Numerous other injuries were also found, indicating that the child had been the victim of a deliberate massacre. She had been systematically beaten over a long period. When the story reached the local community, attacks on Koekemoer began. During his detention, he was beaten multiple times and repeatedly threatened with death. However, Louisa, despite her complicity, did not seem to be targeted by the police. Gradually, the town's residents learned that she might have been involved in her daughter's death, just like the stepfather, and decided to take revenge on her. On the eve of the funeral, on November 4, 2016, Louisa was visited by two unknown women in police uniforms. They persuaded her to come with them to make a statement at the station. In reality, they took her out of town and severely beat her. It turned out that these women were not police officers, but locals who had decided to lynch her. In the end, Poppie's mother came to say goodbye to her child at the funeral in almost the same condition as the girl, but unlike her, still alive. Poppie's biological father, Christo van der Merwe, was seen crying during the farewell ceremony. He sat in the front row alongside friends and relatives. He blamed his ex-wife, who in his opinion had always been a bad mother, for everything. Louisa's face, which showed signs of a recent beating, displayed no remorse throughout the entire service, as if she were indifferent to her daughter's death. Louisa was arrested on December 15, 2016, facing the same charges as her husband. Despite the rapid progress of the case, the trial was postponed by a year. The hearings did not begin until October 2017. There were several reasons for this. The first was that there were no defense attorneys willing to represent the interests of the accused in court. The lawyers felt hostility toward the child murderers and refused to work with them. Furthermore, the constant attacks by fellow inmates forced Koekemoer to attempt suicide twice. Both times, the perpetrator's stomach was pumped, and he had to spend a long time recovering in the hospital. In any case, the postponement of the hearings was only to the prosecution's advantage. The additional time was enough to thoroughly question Johan, the brother of the dead girl. The boy claimed that his stepfather had beaten him and his sister daily, and the mother had simply watched quietly and even covered for her spouse, not trying to help them. According to the child, the beatings were so severe that the sounds of the blows were sometimes louder than their cries of pain. The boy's words were crucial in accusing his mother. Until the end, Louisa tried to justify herself. When she brought her daughter to the hospital, she claimed she had tried to revive her by splashing water on her face and performing resuscitation measures. Johan said that his sister was actually all wet, because after the beatings, her stepfather had dunked her head in the toilet and tried to bring her back to consciousness by flushing. During this procedure, according to Johan, the mother had simply stood in the doorway and watched without seriously trying to intervene. In the end, both were found guilty of the girl's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Additionally, each received another 10 years for endangering the life of their older child, who had miraculously survived the daily abuse. Even the judge was angry during the sentencing. He was not only outraged by the cruelty of these people, but also by their complete indifference to what had happened. All present agreed that the defendants were indifferent to the girl's death. They only cared about the punishment they would receive for it. During the trial, it became known that the neighbor had repeatedly appealed to social services to investigate the family for child abuse, but no one had responded to his appeals or rescued the children. Subsequently, the social workers, who should have contacted law enforcement, justified themselves by citing the distance and bureaucratic difficulties that prevented them from responding to the family's abuse. They were not held accountable for their negligence. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.